Hey everybody, welcome back. In this video, I am going to be talking through the filigree process when making a leather belt. A lot of the things we're going to discuss will translate into other leather crafting projects. However, as most of you know, belts are what I make most often, and they seem to be what a lot of you are interested in making. So that's what we got on the workbench. To be completely honest with you, I don't do a lot of filigree work, but I've done enough in the past and made a lot of mistakes along the way and learned from those mistakes. So hopefully throughout this video, I can at least get you on the right path to doing good filigree work. I'm going to be talking through everything from the type of leather I'm using, the types of tooling designs you need to create to do a good filigree job, the tools you're going to need to do the filigree work, different types of inlay pieces if you want to inlay that piece of leather, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, let's jump right on into this video. So if you're not familiar with what filigree work is when it comes to leather crafting, what we're actually going to be doing is cutting away material or removing leather from this belt. So if you'll take a look up close on this particular design, all of the backgrounding areas that I would normally stamp or tool down are left blank. And that's because we are going to be removing all of those background areas, and in this instance, adding an additional piece of material or an inlay piece of leather behind this main body and in between the liner. So I normally make my belts double layered. In this instance, this belt is going to be triple layered, and I'll talk to you more about that in a little bit on how to tackle that without going way overboard. But what that inlay piece is going to do is really highlight those backgrounding areas and make this floral design look three-dimensional, as if it's popping off of the belt. So this is a really cool technique, and it adds a really nice touch to your project in the end, but it can be dangerous and it's definitely time consuming. So let's go over to the workbench and dive off into this thing. So first and foremost, let's talk about the leather that we're going to be using. Most of you know that I prefer Herman oak for my tooling leather. So with my main body and my liner here, both of these pieces are Herman oak full grain natural vegetable tanned leather. Now we will have that inlay piece that I mentioned earlier, but I'll talk more about that here in a second. But right off the bat, what you'll notice with this main body that I tooled these designs out on is this is a lot thinner of a piece of leather than I normally use when making belts. So most of the time when I'm making my belts, I'm working with a 9/10 ounce main body and a 3/4 ounce liner. But that's just to achieve the weight and structure of the belt that I prefer. Everybody does that differently. You can go about it however you want, but that is how I get the weight that I like. However, on a filigree belt, to achieve the weight and structure that I like, I'm actually going to reduce that main body weight down to a 5/6 ounce piece and increase the liner up to a 5/6 ounce piece. So I'm going to be using two pieces of 5/6 ounce compared to my normal 9/10 3/4. And the main reason being is on this main body, when we go to filigree it, we're actually going to cut out and remove these background pieces. And it is a lot easier of a process and a lot less of a headache removing material out of a thin piece of leather than it is a heavier weight piece of leather. So for an example, I have made a filigree belt before where the main body was made out of 9/10 ounce piece of leather, and that thicker leather, just trying to cut out those background pieces, it took a lot longer and it was not that enjoyable. So whether it be a belt, a wallet, any item that you can get away with reducing the weight of leather while still achieving the structure and stability that you need in the end result, then I would recommend doing that. There are going to be some projects where you obviously still have to work with heavier leather, and that's fine. But if you can reduce the weight, then it is going to make it a little bit easier on you and make the process more enjoyable. Just keep in mind when you do drop down in weight, and this thinner leather is going to be more apt to stretch when you tool on it. So however you want to go about backing that leather, just make sure that you back it very well before you tool on it to try to mitigate the amount of stretch that will occur throughout that process. Another part of this process I'm showing you that's technically optional is adding this additional third piece of leather as the liner. You don't really have to do that if you don't want. It's just personal preference. Some people will just filigree the main body and then add the inlay piece and just let that rough side of that inlay piece be the belt liner. And it's just the inside of the belt. No one's going to see it, so it's really not that big of a deal. I just prefer to line all of my belts with a clean finished piece of leather like this rather than being the rough outside. So for this video, we are going to be adding this third piece of leather. I have seen people even just tool and filigree a heavier weight belt and just let it be a single ply belt and not add anything on the backside and just let their pants or whatever they're wearing show through these filigree spots. So that's an option too. Just keep in mind that we are removing material from this piece of leather and it's going to make it a little bit more fragile. So adding that inlay piece and that liner back to it is going to help bring some stability and structure back to this belt and increase the longevity of it. So again, for my belts and for this video, we are going to be using all three pieces of leather: the main body, the inlay, and the liner piece. Hopefully I've still got your attention, because this is where it gets really cool. When we start talking about the actual inlay piece, or the material that we're going to sandwich in between the two main pieces of leather, this is when you can get really creative and really custom on these belts. So, or any product that you're going to be filigreeing at that. If you look at a lot of old school traditional Western products that have been filigreed, you're more than likely going to see this white color. White is a classic. It's what a lot of people use. It's always a go-to. It's very popular. But there are a lot of different options out there as far as leather goes that you can get your hands on now. Another thing that I've been seeing a lot of people use over the years are these metallic leathers now. They're super bright. They're super flashy. They add a lot of pop to the product. I have this metallic red, I have a metallic blue. You can get these in gold, silver, so there's a lot of really cool options with this as well. And then you can also dive off into the world of exotics. I see people use snake skins, alligators, and since I'm making this belt for myself, I wanted to do something unique that I've never done and I've never seen, so I was kind of leaning towards that world, but I didn't necessarily want to break the bank. So what I did was I went through Maker's Leather Supply and bought some ostrich legs. Now, I've never worked with ostrich legs before. They are considered an exotic leather, but they're fairly inexpensive. These were $15 a piece, and I'm super pleased with them, honestly. They came in, this is an emerald green color, and this is a light colored baby blue, and I absolutely love this color. This is the one that I'm going to be using on this belt. It was kind of a shot in the dark when I purchased these because it didn't say the exact color it was going to get, but this was best case scenario. This is literally exactly what I was hoping for, so I'm super excited to use this. This is a 2 to 3 ounce piece of leather, so it's very thin and very ideal for an inlay piece as well. You want that inlay piece to be fairly thin. Sometimes you'll get some 2 to 3 ounces that are kind of on the heavier 3 ounce side, and you'll have to do a lot of skiving because you want the center of that belt to be kind of structured and have body to it, but you don't want the edges to get too thick. So I'll talk more about that here in a little bit, and if I end up having to skive this, I'll let you guys know and show you. This obviously isn't the length of the belt either, so I'm going to have to do some cutting and splicing and working around, but I'm going to make this work, and I'll show all of that in the video here in a little bit. But you don't even have to use leather. There's a lot of options out there. Like I said, you can get creative. I've heard of people using denim, different types of fabric. You can get those cool types of bandanas with all those different designs on them. So again, just get creative and use whatever you want. There's no set rules that say this is how you have to do it, this is what you have to use. Just keep all of that in mind. I'm super excited to get this belt finished, so let's get right back to it. So before we get too involved, another thing I'd like to touch on briefly is the tooling designs that are more ideal for filigree. Keep in mind, to do filigree work, you don't have to do these traditional floral Western style designs like these. This is just my style of work, and so this is how I'm going about showing you this process. I've seen a lot of really great leather crafters creating products that are far from this, that are implementing filigree in their work. So keep that in mind. You don't have to be doing this. This is just how I'm showing you. But regardless, you always want to make sure that you're focusing on whatever type of elements are being involved in your work, making sure that they are connected to something. So if we take a closer look at this design that I created, like as most of you know, I draw all of these designs out before I tool them. And so when I am designing this tooling design out, what I'm focusing on is making sure that everything is touching or connected to something in some form or fashion. So I'm making sure that all of my vine work is going out, flowing, touching the border, making sure that everything's connected to the flower petals, making sure that my scrolls are touching the borders, any elements that are coming out in the middle, or at least connecting to another element. You don't want to ever have anything that is just free flowing out here. So if we take a look at this random design that I just kind of drew out to show you this example, if you draw your elements or tool your elements to where they're kind of just coming out here and setting into nothing, just this open void area, when you cut out this background area, you got to remember that this is going to be connected to nothing, and it's going to be more apt to catching or sticking up over time. So the way that we attach the inlay pieces, it's actually going to be glued down to this main body. But again, if something like this catches or gets pulled up, then it's going to break loose from that glue and break that bond. And so this scroll work, all of this stuff right here that's not connected could potentially pop up over time. So it's very important to just make sure that when you are designing your products, if you are at that point where you are designing your own tooling designs, making sure that everything is connecting in some way. I hope that makes sense. I know a lot of you guys are using my belt patterns now, and so something that I would look for if you're trying to find a pattern to implement filigree work in, another thing that I don't really like is if you take a pattern like this, you'll notice if you can pick out the backgrounding areas on this design, all of these backgrounding areas are very, very small. And me personally, if I'm going to go through the trouble of filigreeing a belt, I want to make sure to be able to see it. So I would opt for something more like this pattern where everything is still structured properly, everything's touching, but these background pieces, there's a little bit of size to them. So when you cut them out and add an inlay piece, you're going to be able to see it, and it kind of serves the point of filigreeing it. These little bitty pieces, you can still do it. There's nothing wrong with it. I just personally wouldn't really want to go through and take the time to cut all these really, really tiny pieces out to really not even potentially notice that they've been cut out. So again, this is a really good pattern that you could use to filigree if you are wanting to use my belt patterns. If you didn't know, I do offer these belt patterns as digital downloads on my website. You can go purchase them. All of the belt patterns on these sheets are 3 separate belt patterns. This is actually a really cool pattern that I haven't tooled out yet, but it would be great for filigree work because all of these background pieces are relatively the same size, so you would get a consistent look of that filigree throughout the belt, and everything seems to be touching properly. So that would be another cool one. This oak leaf pattern right here, it looks like it would be decent. So again, if you want to use these patterns, go ahead, but if you are designing your own tooling patterns, just keep in mind that you want to make sure, if you're doing floral work, especially like this, make sure your vines are stretched out to those borders or at least touching another element in some form or fashion and not just kind of free floating out there. When it comes to the tools that you're going to need to perform the filigree work, there's really no right or wrong way to go about it. As long as you get these backgrounds cut out, then that is the main objective of this process. So what I am going to be primarily using and what most people use is just a very sharp X-Acto blade knife like this. I'm going to put this to the side because I'll show you more about that here in a minute. There are people that make specific knives for filigree work that you can purchase out there. There's tools that are made specifically for this, but again, go about it however you want. You can get swivel knife blades that are made for filigree work, so a different type of blade you could put in your swivel knife and cut it out like that. There are a lot of people who make their own tools, so they probably wouldn't do it to a nice tool like this, but you can get an old tool that is shaped similar to certain background areas that would be chiseled out, and you can file and grind those down and make it a sharp tool and actually create your own chisels to use for the background pieces. Or I have actually even used before, and I may even use on this belt, these wood carving chisels. These are very inexpensive. I can't find the price on these, but I think these were only like 10 bucks at Harbor Freight. And a lot of these, there's a lot of different shapes and angles in these tools, and a lot of these tools in these wood chisel sets actually fit some good areas in background and hard to reach areas in these backgrounding spots. So I do pull these out every now and then when I am doing the filigree work, and I may, like I said, pull it out on this belt, but I'll open those up and show you those here in a minute. And then there's certain areas where you could even get by with just using a simple hole punch. These are a tool that most leather crafters have in their shop somewhere, and for some instances I've seen some people punch out flower centers and let that flower center be filigreed, or you may be working with a pattern where there is a lot more circular motion like a flow or a scroll, excuse me. The center of this scroll right here could be punched out with a simple hole punch rather than taking a knife and slowly cutting that area out. Or if we look at this leaf right here, you have kind of a tight circle right here. You could take that hole punch and punch this little area out and then just trim the rest of it out rather than being really careful with your knife that you're using and slowly cutting that out. So those are a few ways that can make the job a little bit easier. Like I said, there's really no right or wrong way to go about it. As long as you keep all your digits intact and get the background out, then that's really all that matters. Another thing I'll touch on very quickly is you may have noticed that I actually did tool the backgrounding areas in this particular spot on the belt. And that is because this is the tip of the belt. This is where the holes will be punched in the end and used to connect to the buckle. And since this area is going to be used more than the rest of it over time and more susceptible to wear and tear, I should say, we're going to go ahead and leave everything structurally intact in this spot of the belt. We don't want to remove material. We want the belt to be as strong as it can in this particular spot, just to increase the longevity of the belt over time. If you were to go ahead and run a design up here all the way to the tip, you can see it's perfectly fine to leave areas to filigree up here. But anywhere there's going to be holes or there's potential for extra wear and tear over time, it's generally a safer option to just not filigree in that area. Just tool it out like you normally would. I've also already put this belt through my finishing process. This is something that is probably more personal preference than anything because I don't think it's that big of a deal. I've seen people wait and do their finishing process after they filigree because they want that antique to darken up the inside of these lines after they get everything cut out. I went ahead and antiqued this, dyed it, sealed it up, all of that before I filigreed. Like I said, it doesn't really matter, but just keep that in mind as well. If you want to make sure that you get the inside of your lines dark from the antique, then you may wait to do your finishing process until after you get all of these spots cut out and removed. Now I'm going to go ahead and start off with my X-Acto blade that I mentioned, and this is a brand new blade, so it's really sharp, but I did go ahead and strop it a few times to polish it up And I'm just using a scrap piece of leather with some green jeweler's rouge on it, and I will actually strop this quite a bit throughout the process because you want this blade to be as polished as you can to keep it cutting smoothly through this leather. And another thing to keep in mind is this is very dangerous. You don't want to slip, you don't want to cut yourself because these blades are super sharp. So the number one thing when you're doing this to keep in mind is be patient. Don't get in too big of a rush. You don't want to slip and cut your leather, but you dang sure don't want to slip and cut yourself either. So just take your time, be as careful as you can about it. If you don't feel comfortable using the knife, then I'll show you again a few tools here in a minute on how to chisel these spots out in a different method. But we're going to start off with this knife because it is probably the most common way of doing this. I see more people use the knives than anything. But to start off, really what you want to do, it's a knife, so instinctually a lot of people want to try and cut with that knife, but it's usually better to just go ahead and stick it in the leather all the way through, and then you're going to have a little bit more control working the leather rather than the knife. So once this is actually in the leather, you're going to see me moving the belt more than I am the knife. I may slowly tweak the knife like this back and forth to kind of give it some action and help cut it along these areas. But to have a little bit more control, I'm actually going to be slowly moving the belt more than the knife. This is also a little bit awkward with the camera in my face, so I'm probably going to be taking a little bit more time and be a little bit more careful than I normally would to try and not mess anything up. But I'm just going to go ahead and try to stick that blade in this spot and then slowly cut. So what I did was cut a line straight down this part of the background. Now I'm going to go ahead and work around this little curve. You could also wear a protective glove if you are more comfortable with that to try and protect yourself. There's one piece. A lot more to go. There you have it. That is as simple as it gets, just cutting out the background areas. I am going to go ahead and move down the belt and switch up the tools a little bit so I can show you some different ways to go about it without using that knife, because it is dangerous and it can be slow going. So let's whip out some different tools now. So here are just a few of those wood chisels that were in that box I showed earlier. As you can see, there are many different shapes and sizes when it comes to these wood chisels. And you might not have every perfect shape or size for the background pieces you have, but if you can make these work in some of the areas and at least get those background pieces started with these and then go back and finish them up with your knife, it'll still make this process a little bit quicker rather than cutting every single background piece out, because with these you can find an area that it fits in, strike it once or twice with the maul, and then you're done. You don't got to deal with it anymore. But again, like I said, you might not have every perfect shape for the background areas, but as long as you can get a lot of those areas started and then just touch it up with the knife later, it'll still go by a little bit quicker and be a little bit safer. And once you get all of those background areas cut out, you're probably going to notice some of these fuzzy pieces through all these open spaces. You can just take any kind of glider like this and on the back side go through and lightly singe those pieces down. Just be careful, you don't want to burn the belt. You don't want to leave it in any one spot very long. Just go through and lightly singe any of those fuzzy pieces down. And the back side might get a little darker in, where did I do it? Right here. Might get a little bit darker like this, but that's fine. Obviously that's on the back side of the belt and it will be hidden. So let me just show you really quick. Just move it back and forth and slowly singe those little fuzzy pieces down. Alright, so now that we have all of the background pieces out and we're ready to do the inlay portion of this belt, just like I showed earlier, this piece is not as long as the belt, so I'm going to have to do some splicing on this. What my thoughts are is I'm going to cut 3 long strips out of this, splice them together to then hopefully get the length that we need on this. It's obviously ideal to have the inlay piece that you're working with be the length that you need, but that's not the case with this, so I'm going to have to do some working on it. When we're doing the inlay piece, I don't personally like to run the inlay piece edge to edge. So what we're going to do is, on this 1.5 inch wide belt, my tooling window was around 1 inch wide. And so the main thing that I'm focused on is just making sure that I get all of these open spaces covered up, which is, they're from the edge of this open space to the edge of this open space is roughly 1 inch. So I'm going to cut my inlay piece anywhere from 1 1/8 inches to 1 1/4 inches wide, which will go from border to border enough to cover all of these open spaces, but it's not going to go out to the edge. And the reason that I don't like to take it from edge to edge is because you're not going to get as clean of a burnished edge when you do that, because this leather is not going to want to slick up as good as this veg tan, and it's going to have 3 layers there if you take it all the way to the edge, and it's going to be a little bit bulky. So we're going to try to keep most of the meat in the center of this belt where all of these pieces were cut out, and just let the edge be both pieces of veg tan that we can get a good clean burnish on and make it nice and smooth and clean looking. Okay, I have all of my lines laid out for how we're going to chop this thing up. I went ahead and went with 1 3/16 inches on the width of all 3 of these, which is just under 1 1/4 inches, which should be plenty. We were cutting it pretty close. We should have plenty lengthwise, and it was really close as far as the width that we needed. So hopefully this should come out just about perfect. I'm going to go ahead and dice this up and then switch the camera angle. We'll figure out what length we need to get the full inlay on that belt, and then I will splice these together and go from there. Look at that piece. That's so cool, man. I'm going to go ahead and erase these little bit of pencil markings that you can see on the edge. I just don't want that to accidentally show up on the belt when it gets all finished. So I'm just going to go ahead and clean that up ever so slightly. Okay, let me run you guys through where my brain's at and what I'm thinking on this. So I obviously don't want the pieces that are going to be spliced to just be in one of the open spaces where it will be shown. So what I'm kind of planning out here is making my splices go where there's a lot of covered area. So this is a flower or a leaf, and I'm going to try to make that splice happen right behind that. And then there should be a seamless transition, and you shouldn't really see that. So the way I'm going to splice these also is I'm going to cut them to length, and then I'm going to skive both ends of each piece down really good so that they aren't extra thick and there isn't a bump there. So I'm going to skive them together, and then I'm going to do maybe a 1/2 inch overlap and just contact cement those together. and that should work out. That's what I'm thinking anyways. I'm also going to go through and skive down all of the edges of all of these pieces. It's super thin, it's only around 2 ounces. If you got a 2 to 3 ounce, like I mentioned earlier, that's on the heavier 3 ounce side, then I would highly recommend skiving at least the edges down fairly thin, because you don't want there to be too much of a bump there when you go to connect the liner to this piece, if that makes sense. If there's that additional layer there and it's too thick, then you're going to kind of fold those main body and that liner in on each other instead of connecting well. So I'm going to try to skive that middle piece down, these edges right here. That way everything comes together nice and clean and the edge isn't all wonky in the end. Alright, it's getting pretty late in the night and I don't know if my brain's working like it should be, so I'm going to sleep on this idea and pick back up on this tomorrow because I don't want to screw anything up. So right now I'm just taking the back side of this inlay piece and skiving these edges down, and like I said, they are already very thin, but I'm going to take it down as thin as I can without ripping it or tearing through, so that when we go to put the liner on to the main body, that edge isn't too big of a bump in the middle, like I've already explained. So this is honestly skiving down fairly easy. I'm kind of surprised, but yeah, just taking that edge down ever so slightly. This part's kind of difficult because there was a sticker on the back, so it's kind of sticky here. We'll make it work. And trust me, I know skiving is not very fun, but it is going to create a better product in the end. So there's a lot of times in this craft when you need to implement this skill, so I do recommend working at it, and when there's a chance that something needs to be skived down, take the time and skive it down. Alright, I went ahead and got all of my edges skived down and the areas that will be spliced. I skived those down about as comfortably as I could without ripping through that leather. And for the adhesive that I'm going to use, I don't feel like messing with my barge, so I'm just going to be using this Skiving's leathercraft cement and then this plastic paddle to spread that on there. Whoa, I got a little bit too much. Yeah, I got a lot. Oof. 1 second. There we go. I think that's how it's supposed to be done. But I could be wrong. If I am, tell me in the comments. Because I don't use this stuff very much. This does say stick them together while it's still wet. So, yeah, we did it right. It's not like it's that big of a deal. This is going to be glued in between two pieces of leather in the end regardless, so it shouldn't move or anything. I think I made more of a mess than I, golly, about knocked the camera over. And after all of that, now we have one big long ostrich leg inlay piece. And all of these spliced areas, just like I mentioned earlier, are going to be hidden behind leaves and flowers throughout the belt, so they shouldn't be seen. But let's keep moving on. So now we're getting to the stages of assembly, and we're about to attach this inlay piece to the main body. And this is something that's very important I want to touch on very quickly. There is a mistake that I've made in the past that I don't want you to make, and it comes within this process. However you want to go about gluing this together is completely up to you. If you want to use something like this or your barge and just carefully glue through all this without getting it in all these open spaces, by all means do that. I prefer to use spray adhesive, and there's all kinds of brands out there. I just have this Elmer's Extra Strength spray adhesive. I do prefer the extra strength. And what we're going to do is spray this main body really well. We're not going to glue this inlay piece. We're just going to spray this main body alone and then attach that inlay piece. If you were to glue this inlay piece whenever it is attached, anything and everything in the world that can get in these little open areas will get in there and get stuck and be almost impossible to clean out. So we're not going to glue the inlay piece. We're going to spray this spray adhesive on the main body really well, attach this, and it will be sufficient to hold everything in place. And then a little bit later on, we'll go through and contact cement our main liner on this, stitch it all up, and it'll be good to go. I would recommend doing this in a well-ventilated area. I would normally go outside to do this, but it's raining, so in my shop is going to have to work. I've also just got an old box that I've got the belt on, just to make sure that none of the glue gets through these open areas and ruins my table. Be aware of the overspray that this can produce as well, so keep everything important away from this. I'm going to move this liner, but as I go through and stick this liner onto the main body, another thing I'm going to try to do is lay it all down as straight as I can, but I don't really want to try and, you can if you want, but because I've got these splices lined up in certain areas, I'm going to try not to do very much stretching as I go through here, because this liner is thin, it's just going to be more apt to stretch as you lay it down if you really kind of pull on it. So I'm just going to try to lay it down and let all of these areas match up where I intended them to match up, and then we should be good. If you move it like I did, also be aware that there's a lot of sticky glue here, so don't move it in the areas that that glue is to keep the front side from getting dirty and sticky. I think this can's about empty. Got a pretty heavy cover on here just to be safe. Try to keep it all as straight as you can. You really want to make sure that you get everything that's open, these open areas covered up for sure though. Just make sure everything is bonded as well as it can be. Now that I got it glued down and everything is in place like I want it, I am just going to leave this alone for a few hours, let that glue set up and help that bond become secure, and then we'll move on with the rest of the process. So for time's sake on this video, I am going to speed the rest of this portion up. I did go ahead and decide that I'm going to buck stitch this belt. And so since I'm doing that, I've got full-length videos that cover how I line a belt, how I finish my edges, how I tackle buck stitching. So if you are interested in actually hearing an in-depth conversation around all of the other things I'm about to do to this belt, then check out those videos. I'll link them in the description. But the only thing I did off camera was I went ahead and skived both pieces down on the buckle end. Since it's 5/6, on a normal belt, a 9/10 ounce belt, I would just skive on the main body, but since this is 5/6 and they're both thinner, then I went ahead and skived both the liner and the main body just a little bit. So we're gonna speed things up. Let's get to it.